This video is brought to you by Nebula. Last week, Moldova's pro-Western government collapsed, apparently as a result of its mishandling of the cost of living crisis. However, in the days since, there have been reports that the Kremlin is trying to stage a coup, and a tense political crisis is brewing. So in this video, we'll look into the recent collapse, Russia's interference, and how all this might affect the geopolitical balance of power in Europe. Now, to understand this story, you need to know a bit about Moldovan politics, and specifically how Moldova has oscillated between pro-Russian and pro-Western governments since its independence in the early 1990s. For those of you who don't know, Moldova is a small country tucked between Romania and Ukraine, with a population of about 2.6 million. Like Ukraine, it used to be a part of the Soviet Union, carved up after World War II from the formerly Romanian-controlled region of Bessarabia. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moldova has been torn between Russia to the east and the EU to the west. While most Moldovans support closer ties with the West, a recent poll found that 63% of Moldovans were in favour of joining the EU, a single minority, especially ethnic Russians in the breakaway region of Transnistria, instead favour closer ties with Russia, and many Moldovans are wary of getting too close to the West and the EU too quickly for fear of upsetting either Transnistria or Russia. This is why Moldovan governments have regularly shifted between liberal pro-European and leftist pro-Russian political forces, usually represented by the Moldovan Communist Party. Moldova has a long history of communism, which partially explains why the relatively pro-Russia Communist Party has fared so well at the ballot box, even if most Moldovans want closer ties with the West. The Communists won Moldova's first election in 1994, before the 1998 election was won by a pro-Western coalition known as the Alliance for Democracy and Reforms. The communist PCRM then returned to power in 2001, which made Moldova the first and so far the last post-Soviet state where unreformed communists came back to power. In 2009, the PCRM originally won a narrow majority, but the election had to be rerun twice because the non-communists in the Moldovan parliament refused to vote for the communist presidential candidate, who required 61 votes to be sworn into office. At the third time around, the communists failed to win a majority, and the various opposition parties tried to form a coalition. From 2009 until 2021, no party won an outright majority, with the balance of power shifting between the pro-Russian communists and socialists and a coalition of smaller pro-European parties. This all changed at the most recent elections in 2021, which were won by the liberal PAS party, originally founded by the current president Maia Sandu. With around 53% of the vote, they won 63 seats in the 101-seat parliament via Moldova's PR electoral system, and Natalia Gavrilița became the country's new prime minister. In second place, the bloc of Communists and Socialists, or BCS for short, led by former Communist President Vladimir Voronin, received 27% of the vote and 32 seats. Finally, the populist pro-Russian SOR party, led by a Jewish businessman, Ilan Sor, won 6% of the vote, and no other party crossed the 5% electoral threshold. By the way, Sor was convicted in 2017 for his role in the 2014 Moldovan bank scandal, which saw the disappearance of over $1 billion from a series of Moldovan banks. Sor was sentenced to 7.5 years in jail, but he fled to Israel, where he resides as a fugitive. Sor is also alleged to have direct links to Russia, and the Washington Post reported last year that the Kremlin had sent funds and strategists to help his party subvert the government. Anyway, this unprecedented victory set Moldova on a course towards Europe. Moldova even became an official candidate for EU membership along with Ukraine last year, which was a landmark achievement for Gavrilica's government. Originally, the new PAS government were pretty unpopular. For the first few months until early 2022, they maintained a steady lead over their opponents in the polls. However, the post-COVID spike in inflation and then the war in Ukraine pushed the country into a cost of living crisis, which caused a sharp decline in the government's popularity. Previously, Moldova was entirely reliant on gas pipes from Russia passing through Ukraine, which were majorly disrupted in the course of the war. To replace the shortfall, Moldova had to secure power from Romania at a near triple cost. Last year, inflation reached 34%, with food prices up by 39% and regular blackouts. This is obviously terrible news in and of itself, but it's made worse by the fact that Moldova is one of the poorest countries in Europe. Moldova has a GDP per capita of just $5,000. The average monthly wage is €420, and about 10% of the population live in absolute poverty, according to a 2016 UN report. Unsurprisingly, this triggered mass unrest in the country's capital on the 6th of November, with 50,000 people coming to protest and calling for the government's resignation and snap election. Ilan Sor, who is alleged to have direct ties to the Kremlin and even receiving funding directly from the FSB, emerged as the main opposition figure at the forefront of these near-weekly protests and saw a surge in the polls as a result. In the end, the pressure was just too much for Gavrilita's cabinet, and the government collapsed on February the 10th. In response, President Sandu has decided to appoint Dorin Resian, an independent, as interim prime minister. A day or so later, Sandu claimed that Russia was attempting to stage a coup against her government using foreign saboteurs, citing reports by the Ukrainian intelligence service. For context, just a day before the government collapsed, Zelensky told the European Union that his intelligence services had uncovered plans by the Russian state to, quote, destroy Moldova. And Moldova's intelligence and security service released a statement confirming it had received information from our Ukrainian partners. With the help of 1,500 Russian troops residing in Transnistria and diversionists in civilian clothing, the plan allegedly is to violently overthrow the government and seize government buildings. This is consistent with comments by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who warned Moldova earlier this month that it could meet the same fate as Ukraine if it became another, quote, anti-Russian project. Sandu urged the Moldovan parliament to give the country's intelligence and security service the necessary means to fight more effectively against national security threats in response. Now, while there's clearly some truth to these reports, it's worth keeping in mind that the primary cause of Moldova's political crisis is the cost of living crisis. Nonetheless, this is deeply worrying, especially given Moldova's pre-existing political insecurity and the tense situation with Transnistria. And the West would be well advised to keep a close eye on the situation as it develops. Transnistria is one of the many interesting places in the world that are underestimated and under-discussed. In fact, there are fascinating places and countries all over the world which you've maybe never even heard of.
So, our friends over at Wendover Productions have a whole series where they dive into how and why some of the world's most remote settlements exist. From remote communities in the middle of Australia to why one of Italy's most visited places is dying. That series, Extremities, is exclusively available on Nebula, the streaming service that we're building with a bunch of our creator friends, many of whom you likely already know and love. And if you sign up to Nebula, you'll find all of our videos ad-free and occasionally before they're even released on YouTube. On top of that, you'll also find a whole bunch of TLDR explainers available exclusively on Nebula, plus an extended version of our show, The Daily Briefing, every single weekday. As I say though, there's more than just TLDR on Nebula. There's a whole bunch of other original series that we know you'll love, like Real Life Law's Incredible Modern Conflicts, which breaks down contemporary disputes around the world, Neo's Underexposure, which runs through contentious and controversial topics you wish you'd always know more about, and of course Extremities. All of these things are exclusively available on Nebula, just like our extended daily briefings and a whole bunch of other exclusive TLDR content, which will never make it to YouTube. So if you want to sign up, the best way to do it is using our link in the description, which, with our special discount, gets you the whole service for just a couple of pounds a month. A couple of pounds which doesn't just go to some weird sponsor, but directly goes to educational creators like us. And that helps us out a whole lot, as does watching on Nebula more generally. So thanks for signing up, and we'll see you on Nebula.